I think psychedelics allow people to kind of step outside themselves, like give them a third person perspective, kind of, I guess.
When you become aware that you have a choice of how you react to your reaction, then you're like, oh, that's like an infinite power you can carry forward somewhat.
I can't emphasize enough to really listen to people when they talk about their benefits, they talk about their experience, because that information is gold.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
For many people, psychedelic drugs like LSD or psilocybin are their first major introduction to a profoundly altered state of consciousness. I mean, other than dreaming, orgasm, near-death experiences, transcendental meditation, or taking too much Robitussin, etc. The point is, there are many different forms of consciousness, and some drugs, especially psychedelics, are really good at showing people how networks in the brain can be tweaked to show you something very different. Mental conditions like autism or ADHD are other forms of consciousness, although they don't wear off after 12 hours, and so-called, quote, neurotypical people often have misconceptions about these mental arrangements. Many folks with autism don't see their condition as a defect or something to be fixed, an attitude that has sparked the neurodiversity movement. But autism does come with its own set of challenges. Some especially find difficult in socializing with others. A very early body of scientific research suggests that psychedelics could help with some of the challenges of autism. MAPS, for example, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, is exploring using MDMA to treat social anxiety caused by autism. But some folks with autism aren't waiting for the science to catch up and are trying psychedelics already. I'm Troy Farah, and you're listening to Narcotica. Our guests today are Aaron Orsini, author of the book Autism on Acid, How LSD Helped Me Understand, Navigate, Alter, and Appreciate My Autistic Perceptions, and Justine Lee, a graduate student in pharmacology at UC Irvine with a BS in neurobiology. Aaron, Justine, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us, Troy.
You know, first I want to mention that this episode is being produced in partnership with Filter Magazine. There's going to be an article on this exact same topic, so you can read about it at filtermag.org. Before we get into this discussion about psychedelics and autism, you know, I know you're both really responsible about this, so I'll let you insert all the caveats you want, such as we're not suggesting anybody with autism actually take psychedelics. They're not a panacea. They are definitely not a cure. Some people want to, cure autism, but that's not the goal here. Many people with autism do not see their brains as, quote, broken, just wired differently. So maybe we can start with maybe addressing some misconceptions about autism, what it's like to have it, and the whole neurodiversity thing. Maybe first of all, autism is best understood as a spectrum, and so people can experience it in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, we would definitely echo those same sentiments as far as safety and the consultation of relevant professionals, and all of this is essential to our messaging as well. And in specific, in relation to the question of neurodiversity, a big part of the project that we're currently involved in revolves around really gaining a more well-rounded understanding of the needs of this population therein. I myself am diagnosed autistic as well as ADHD. And really, through the process of publishing my first book and putting that out there, I don't think even during that process I was quite so fully aware of the variety of experiences of other autistics out there. And so a large part of my personal work, from shifting from the publishing of that book to now the running of our organization here, is really oriented around gathering those insights and those perspectives and trying to really come up with ways to really be more fully representative of those individuals. And, as far as, the question of like, what is autism? There's 10,000 different ways to answer this. You could find, many different theories from like a scientific perspective, none of which are necessarily unified just yet. You could point to different diagnostic tools, which again, there's like dozens of diagnostic tests that are culturally dependent, that are like utilized for different reasons, different purposes. And so oftentimes, when that question of, what is autism is positioned to me, the most immediate and ready-made response that I have is really just to defer to the individuals for their own unique subversion therein of autism to them. I can speak certainly to my own experience. I can speak, the words of other persons who've offered their words about their experiences, but it's just such a case-by-case basis that I don't want to add to one of the larger kind of cultural dilemmas, which is how can we avoid, the sort of casualties of generalizations, while at the same point, how can we arrive to enough agreement that, I could certainly, vouch for the individual on, and for them to be able to identify with their diagnosis in whatever way, shape, or form. But ultimately, these things get pushed through the filter of, does this qualify for a medical benefit? Does this qualify for an accommodation in the workplace? So as much as we would love to keep the nuance alive and well, that nuance has to be pushed through some kind of conceptual netting in order for it to be integrated into the civilized world. So again, I recognize that my own answer is somewhat abstract, but that's the result of my own kind of carefulness to not recreate some of those kind of issues related to, steamrolling someone who might be an outlier within the same umbrella of the same diagnosis.
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance there, which I appreciate. Justine, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I just defer to Aaron here because there's not really consensus as to what the cause is, or there's just it's just a big kind of collection of symptoms apparently at this point. And so Aaron had put a lot of details in his answer, and I really like what he came up with. So I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I'm really kind of a big fan of this concept called neurodiversity, which was coined in 1998 by sociologist Judy Singer. It's it's sort of reframing how autism isn't a disability; it's just a different way of the human mind forming. And according to one of the dominant theories of neuroscience, human consciousness plays on this concept of emergence. It's several distant systems working together that creates this perception. And many people with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, just manifest their consciousness differently, if I'm understanding this correctly. So I guess, what is your take on this principle, and how does that fit into using psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's very much at the core of what we're exploring and what we're learning from other individuals. And, to frame it in one light, I feel it's within reasonability to sort of describe the autistic experience as an altered state experience in terms of its contrast to the quote, neurotypical experience, perhaps. We hear from individuals who will be reporting if you're seeing autism through the lens of a sensory peculiarity, or, I have a hypersensitivity to sound and light, but maybe a hyposensitivity to certain kinds of kinesthetic inputs or other things. There's all of these kinds of varying intelligences and varying degrees of sensory intensity that impact, what stands out in a given environment. How do we navigate that environment? And so, we put together these kind of 7 essential takeaways that we felt were the most important things for people to kind of take away from this. And in addition to the first one being primarily this exploration, as you said earlier, is not targeting the cure or the elimination of autism as a neurotype, because it's our stance that indeed autism is a neurotype. But the second one being this idea that it can afford autistics an ability to have a reappraisal of their default mode of processing the world. So in other words, they can see how they normally see. When they step outside of that normal way of seeing, they gain that perspective on how they might normally see. And in that way, it's very similar to how maybe anyone of any sort of neurotype, of any disposition, might kind of experience psychedelics. It's the idea that it's mind manifesting or mind aware, the idea that you can, have a perspective on the formation of your perspectives is, it has an inherent utility for anyone, but we find it to be really beneficial within persons who are reporting things, I feel most comfortable speaking from my own perspective. And I also have some quotes I can also read as well at a later point in the talk if we have time. But for myself, it was coming into this awareness that I was missing this sort of like energetic signature of other beings in my proximity. And I'm still navigating what that really means, because part of me wonders still to this day, like, is the reason why that information is like not reaching all the way through to my awareness at times because I'm undersensitive to that stimulus? Or is it that it's so intense in certain environments that I'm filtering it out, like in order to just endure a given situation? Like another example that maybe comes to mind is an individual who mentioned that following a psychedelic experience, they went to like a crowded bar kind of environment, and they noticed like, wait, maybe I'm not an introvert. Maybe it's just when I go to a very busy, high stimulus place, I like immediately my energy just gets like eroded really rapidly because of that. I've heard others refer to it as a sort of like a skinless sort of way of like maybe like an unfiltered sort of way of encountering these sorts of high stimulus environments. Like when you don't have that barrier or that filter, then, you know, a very common situation can become like very taxing very quickly. And so again, more than, you know, for in a majorative sense, a lot of persons who are navigating these psychedelic experiences seem to be stating that they're still returning to their relative baseline. They're still returning to their sense of kind of who they are. But in that returning, they gain a perspective on who that, you know, normal baseline default mode person is. And similarly, they become aware simultaneously of not only maybe some sensory inputs that they might be filtering out, but also they become aware like, oh, I'm very sensitive to this, because all of a sudden like that becomes very dominant in their field. And they start to wonder like, just in my own progression, I thought that my experience as an autistic was very much like universal. I thought that my experience with psychedelics was universal. And neither of those are anywhere close to true. And I didn't know this until I started to really crosstalk with other people to be like, oh, like sometimes it feels like when I speak with certain people, they seem to be talking about their regular awareness as though like they're in my psychedelic state and vice versa. And so like, that's interesting to me too, the way that like these substances can kind of like allow us to kind of cross boundary lines and experience like other novel forms of awareness and somehow gain a sort of, you know, immediate kind of understanding. It might not always be like identical. Like at first I thought that I was experiencing kind of like, quote, like neurotypical processing. I don't necessarily think that that's the case. It's just, it's a curiosity of like, oh, is that what that's like when the most immediate sensory thing in my field of awareness is like the vibrational well-being of like the person opposite me? Because in my normal sober state previous to psychedelics, it was more so, you know, like what's the words that are being spoken? I have an assignment due. I have to think about that right now. I was like so much more mental rumination mode. And psychedelics showed me that there was something other than like the voice inside my head to navigate the world, that I could have a direct experience and then make sense of it in that way. So that's a huge part of it. We could unpack that for forever. We're talking about like perception at large. But I'll take pause here and open it up.
I think a part of what attracted me to neuroscience is it kind of rides the line between hard science and there's a bit of a philosophical debate, because nobody can actually step into the mind's eye of somebody else. And so there's this everlasting question, which is like, are you seeing the same red that I'm seeing? And there's no way to really prove that your red is the same as my red. We just assume that it's kind of maybe similar. And it's a simplified version of this kind of analogy of theory of mind. And I think more from a neurotypical perspective, from my conversations with autistics and people in the neurodiverse community, I imagine it as, and Aaron, feel free to correct me here, but if we consider walking is a very complicated process. If we think about how our body has to balance, and then the step we take, and then how much force we have to put in, all of that input is integrated into our brain, and it's been consolidated so that it's not in our immediate awareness, and we just walk. But it seems that maybe other neurotypes are more aware of every specific thing, every stimulus in their environment that they have to be aware of. And so Aaron often uses this analogy of like having a limited bandwidth. And so I kind of picture it for myself. If I had to think about every single movement that I had to make while I was walking, like I couldn't think about anything else other than concentrate on where I was going, what I was doing, so I wouldn't fall over. And so I think with that understanding, it allows me to kind of appreciate what other people might be going through in their heads. And it allows me just like the patience to be like, oh, okay, I can, give you some time, whatever you need, because I don't know what their red is like.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Can we talk about how both of you first discovered and were introduced to psychedelics? Can we start with you, Justine?
Sure. So since my background is in neurobiology, we do study kind of how drugs affect the brain overall. And psychedelics has always been kind of a unknown territory just because the legal status and things like that. So when we covered it, it always sounds so, I don't know, like it sounds a little sparkly. It sounds a little crazy, sounds a little interesting. And so that initially is what attracted me to study more of it. And with all of this research coming out about how powerful these substances are, it only intrigued me even more. And so that's kind of like why I've delved deep into this particular topic as it relates to neuroscience. I guess Aaron's story is kind of out there, how he got introduced to psychedelics.
Well, I'm curious, Justine, if we can stay on you for just a second. Have you tried psychedelics, and if so, what was your experience like?
So I did have the opportunity to go out to Arizona and take the sacrament of peyote, and that was quite an experience. I think because of the environment and the setting that we were under, it was the ceremony in and of itself, I thought was really amazing and beautiful. As far as like, I really can't speak to the experience itself because, to be honest, I got quite nauseous from it. So, but I really believe in what people are saying about it. Like, and there are countless testimonials about all kinds of psychedelics, and so that really inspires me and lights the passion to like pursue these things academically.
Aaron, I'm kind of curious I've heard your story, many times, but if you could share it again.
Sure. Yeah, I've also heard it many times, so I'll give you the superbly condensed version. I was diagnosed at 23. At 27, I tried LSD for the first time, and I had the conventional psychedelic experience that many people would report as far as connecting to nature, to myself, to all these things, a sort of like sense of oneness or wonder. But the thing that stood out was that sort of deep kind of what I've come to learn to be related to in like a term that's referred to as interoceptive processing, and this sort of heightening of my ability to detect inner feeling states. And this has been well established for psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, and it's even Messner and Nichols, I think they coined the term intactogen because of this as well, which is broken down means like to engender a feeling within. And so that for me was kind of going from this sort of muted experience of kind of floating through life, like existing more on like the kind of clinging to the conceptual layer of things and remembering like, I did this, that got that reward. I did this, that gets that reward. But psychedelics really opened me up to this awareness of like, there was an inherent reward in the immediate experience that was unfolding. And because of that, at the time I was in a very dark place mentally at that time when I underwent that LSD session. And I went from being, ideating on suicide essentially to being the most excited to be alive I've ever been, and feeling really connected and feeling this like sense of like, wow, like there's so much here that I was not aware of being here. And I've since, learned how to tap into that space through meditation or breath work or all these other avenues that can lead us like out of that sort of ruminative state and into a more direct experience. And it completely just shifted my priorities from, not necessarily like what's the reward of what I'm doing, but like, how can I have the most rewarding immediate experience, and how can I share that like presenthood with other individuals, and like that being more of a focus or a goal. And I can't really quantify how much of a positive impact that brings to, in some sense, it makes me fully alive, period. Like, and it's, again, I can't emphasize enough that it wasn't, that there's other avenues other than psychedelic substances to get there. It's just that those were teaching tools for me at that time that showed me that this was possible at all. And I've since committed my life to trying to understand how to just continuously reconnect over and over with other individuals, with myself, and with that sort of just that joy of presence, very simply.
That's really interesting. And one of the things I'm, really excited about is that you have started this group called the Autistic Psychedelic Community, which people can learn more about at autisticpsychedelic.com. You guys are hosting weekly Zoom meetings on Sundays where people can talk about this kind of thing. You've kind of met other people that have autism that are interested in this psychedelic question. So tell me a little bit about the group, what you are learning, and, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'll defer to Justine to kind of maybe give a little bit of context on how it all got started and what all we do there, because she's been an awesome support with organizing and everything there. So I'll let her speak a bit about it.
So yeah, it seems like forever ago, but it was actually just like the end of 2019. Based on my understanding of psychedelics and what they could possibly do, I can't really explain why or how it happened, but I had the thought that it might affect people on the spectrum, people with autism, the neurodiverse community. I was very interested in that. And I did a Google search, and Aaron's book was the only thing that really popped up other than this studies from the 60s. And at that time, his book was in Google Doc format. And so I left a message on there saying, hey, I'm really interested, and I think I'm going to research this for like the rest of my life. So I'd love to be able to talk about it. And we like exchanged emails back and forth for a couple weeks. And then he was like, I'm going to start this thing on Sunday. Do you want to help? I'm like, yeah. And like rest is history. We did it for like all of last year. And it's been kind of an amazing journey because, to be honest, I didn't have that much interaction with anybody who was like at least openly autistic. And I didn't even know what neurotype meant. Like all of this vocabulary, this terminology was completely new to me, even as somebody who studied neurobiology. And meeting all of these people and listening to how they experience this world was like, I mean, it blew my mind, like quite literally. And so I can't express enough gratitude for all the community members who have shared their stories and who just like allowed me to be present and listen to them.
Well, what are some of the things that people are saying? What's like I don't know, maybe a typical response, or some of the stuff how is it helping people and that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to field that. So, and the one thing I'd love to point out right off the top is that we actually we gathered a little more than 40 individuals contributed reflections. And we've now bundled those reflections. We're going to publish them soon as an anthology, call it Autistic Psychedelic. And so that's already up for pre-order on our site. So all this stuff is already out there. And all of the book sales go to supporting this ongoing exploration and just the continuous creation of neurodivergent spaces for people to gather. And so like I did bring a couple quotes from that, and I'll let them kind of just speak for themselves. Emily, who is age 20 with Asperger's syndrome, said, LSD had caused me to react to this incredible amount of happiness, which I usually have trouble expressing, by sobbing from that happiness for the very first time in my life. So that's like a very simple, to the point kind of telling. We've also kind of received interesting takes from other individuals. Thomas, who's age 30, he said, he was also diagnosed autistic, ADHD. He said, before psychedelics, when I heard a dog barking outside or a loud car or a door slam or someone dropping a plate, I was getting very angry, almost raging, especially if I tried to concentrate. And this is 100% gone today. When there's a loud noise anywhere, it doesn't hurt anymore. I'm totally calm. And so that starts to dig into some of the gray area. And again, more than us coming here or going anywhere really to declare that we know any one thing just yet, what we're really trying to do is just build this conversation and just create a space for it. And one of these questions ongoing is like, are these changes happening only during the exposure to these substances? Are these changes carried forward? Because I think anyone who's done a psychedelic of any disposition can kind of relate to this idea of like, when you become aware that you have a choice of how you react to your reaction, then you're like, oh, that's like an infinite power you can carry forward somewhat. But the rest is just too complicated to know when it comes to this particular outcome for this individual. That's somewhat of it can be a condition that arises as like a subcondition within autism where loud noises can cause pain or be something that is far beyond my neuroscience knowledge of what's exactly causing this. But the idea that can be, eased during a psychedelic experience or potentially like eased over time is something that's really radical. And I'm not here to claim that that's the case. It's just like when we hear reports like that, it's like there's very little other alternate approaches that I'm aware of that are kind of bringing such a result for individuals, especially when it comes to this idea of like interoception processing and like feeling the self more deeply. Like certainly meditation is a well-established example and other things, but some of these results are really remarkable for individuals who are kind of like waking up in this way. And I'll read just one other quote, and I think this is especially interesting because this is coming from an individual, Ian, who is now age 70, and he went and he was also diagnosed later in his life. And I always find that interesting too. Like someone who's 70 years old today, that wasn't even like a diagnosable condition in his like younger years. Like it wasn't very common. But he said in his later years, he said, the psilocybin trip was transformational. I felt as if my outer shell that had trapped my emotions inside and prevented others from reaching me had been ripped open. I was overwhelmed by unconditional love for everyone around me, and I wanted to care for them and protect them. So again, in some way, some of these outcomes are unique, perhaps in autistic populations or neurodivergent populations. On another level, we're also advocating purely for the cognitive liberty for autistics to be able to explore their consciousness. So far as we're aware, there's no direct contraindication for autistics being unable to undergo these sorts of sessions. And so what you might come to see in the years ahead with Oregon or already with like the Netherlands or Jamaica or legal markets where people can reach services is you might find individuals who are maybe like, oh, I was depressed. I went in and, oh, also this other thing happened while I was receiving those same kind of like sessions. And I think that that's where, some of these trends are going to be able to be more safely unpacked. People might feel more comfortable talking about them if they're doing them without breaking any laws and if they've like done all the proper like medical screenings and everything. And so again, I thought, again, having only my own narrow experience, I thought that everyone's experience was like mine until I like started to just talk to more people. And I was like, no, everyone's psychedelic experience is so different. Everyone's autistic experience is so different. Multiply those two. And it's just like, we have heard so many varied accounts, but like one of the few unifying things is just that obviously they're coming to us we're going to obviously see a more positive trend if people are coming towards us. We're aware of that also, that like we do also hear of challenging experiences. We've done our best to include those as well in this anthology. And a lot of that comes from uneducated and like uneducated use, essentially. Like there's no reason for it, especially now with the changing climate and everything. There's just really no reason for anyone to undergo anything like this without having the utmost level of support and care and awareness for how all these things are. Like we're so close to just being able to like have no stigma at all, to be like, I would like to receive these services. And then like very soon, and certain countries already, these services are just there with like medical support, with all these things. So we're trying to just really encourage like harm reduction and safety at every turn. Yes, this is exciting, but like we don't want any harms to befall anyone out there at all. And that's a part of our group peer support model as well, is to connect people to trustworthy avenues of support and care as well.
That's really great. I really am excited about this community because it is like you said, bringing this conversation into the forefront. And I think it's an important conversation we should be having. You know, hearing people's stories of like sobbing from happiness or being filled with unconditional love is that's similar to some of the experiences I've had in LSD, but you know, it's unique for them, and that's really encouraging. And I'm looking forward to this anthology coming out. This might be difficult to answer because, you know, we can only speak from our own experience, but what are maybe some of the differences between, you know, quote, neurotypical? I don't really like that term, but you know what I mean? Somebody that fits into, I guess, society's standards for something like that. How does a neurotypical person react to psychedelics versus somebody with autism?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the first thing, and you probably already know what I'll say, is that like that's a huge question. I would say, again, going back to that idea of like, you know, at this point, we've heard from maybe a couple hundred people who have submitted stories to us or have shared with us. And based on those, one of the most, you know, predominant trends, and again, you're only really going to hear of a benefit if the person maybe didn't necessarily face that as a challenge previously. So I think, you know, to sort of get at your question, let's say a quote neurotypical person already has a fair degree of, you know, proper interoceptive processing. They're really quite readily aware when they feel angry or sad, or when they're cold, or when their body is hot, or those kinds of things. You know, they might take a psychedelic and they might have an amplification of that state and be like, wow, like the sun felt especially good on my skin today. But that's a contrast to, say, someone who might have these sort of hyposensitivities, who might be like, wow, all of a sudden I could feel temperature very viscerally in a way that, like, they're not talking about like, oh, like it sure did feel especially good. They're like, I could notice temperature. Like that's a significant like paradigm shift for that individual. And that's how it was for me as far as like emotional intuition went. Of just being like there's a story, and actually there was a story that was written, Dr. Julie Holland put a book out called Good Chemistry. And within that story, there was an individual who was also on the spectrum. And there was a story in there, an anecdotal telling of like, he formed a fist at one point in response to a situation he was in. And he was like, wait, I'm mad. Like at the time he was doing like an LSD regimen. And he was like, I'm mad. He's like, I haven't been mad like ever. Like, he's like, I'm actually mad. And like that's like, again, like it's a lot of the issues that some of us face. And again, we're mainly interfacing, we are interfacing with autistic adults. And a lot of the issues that we're facing have to do with like dependencies on external cues or other persons to kind of guide our behavior sometimes. And the real profound possibility of this kind of work is that it shifts the locus of control back to within the individual. Because then they're like, I knew I was mad. Now I know when I'm mad. Now I can change my life and make it so that I'm not mad. Whereas before, that anger just kind of like almost like rots underneath the surface of awareness and just like causes all sorts of like just like ills to the body, to the psyche. And that ability to process instead of just kind of like repress or store or not even come into that awareness, I think that the key differentiator that I feel. And it's that idea of like, I sometimes will refer to it as, in my own story, that I went from being really far in to being kind of baseline, like embodied, whereas others might already be embodied or baseline, and they might go like far out. And that's sort of the subtle difference. And that's where in my book, I talked a lot about like dosing specific changes, because that's really where we're seeing the biggest subtleties and differences, is that like, depending on that baseline beginning point, a certain dose is going to impact someone of a certain predisposition in a radically different way, whether that means like they need more to experience the same subjective outcome or less or whatever it might be. It's just for reasons yet to be understood. Those changes seem to be, really assignable across like this sort of quote, like neurotypical, neurodivergent kind of divide. But again, I can't emphasize enough that even the things that I wrote about in my book, I've met plenty of autistics who are like, I have no problem with interoception. My problem is I feel things really intensely and I would like to like not like, it's like, so it's not any one like uniform experience. It's just that we're predisposed to having these wild variances in sensory input. And so I think the stronger benefit is that idea of just being able to notice how we notice. And the secondary, maybe most dominant trend is this idea of like interoceptive processing being enhanced and that being utile. But that's not a universal symptom or qualifier for autism. So it's just something that we see as a general trend.
Justine, I want to give you the opportunity to weigh in on this if you have anything. Differences between like neurotypical psychedelic experience and somebody on the spectrum.
So the basic biology between all of us is the same. That's the assumption that we're all humans. And so there's an understanding of where these drugs are acting and what receptors they attach to. And it all kind of, it's after that, everything that happens after that. Once the psychedelic binds to the receptor, anything goes. So it's kind of like taking a handful of marbles and just throwing it on the floor and then expecting like, it's never going to make the same pattern. And because it's just so individual. And a common experience that's talked about in the neurotypical experience, quote unquote, is the visual distortions, like certain perceptual changes, like sound gets louder, like certain frequencies they're more sensitive to, and like taste sometimes gets like mixed with sound. And there's this concept called synesthesia, where the senses kind of gets like hearing the sounds and tasting this, tasting the colors and all of that kind of stuff. So there seems to be something going on with the senses as far as like sensory processing, integrating that information, and also the user, I guess, the user's kind of concept of these things. And it allows kind of somebody to take a step back and it's like, what is going on here? And I think that's just kind of like the universal feeling once someone takes a psychedelic. It's like, what? and so, yeah, the neuroscience is very just like it, 5-HT2A receptor, dopamine receptor, blah, 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 blah. But then as far as like the end experience, the benefit, all of those things, it's so highly individual.
Yeah. I want to talk about some of the science that is coming out about psychedelics and autism. So the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, they've been doing clinical trials for several years with MDMA, sometimes known as Molly or ecstasy, to treat social anxiety in people with autism. And there have been some other clinical trials. I don't expect either of you to like be experts on all the stuff that's coming out, but I'd like to hear your opinion on this. Maybe a little bit about how MDMA is different than LSD when it comes to, treating some of this stuff. And if you really want to get into it, like, let's talk about some of like the older science as well from the 60s, which seemed to really have a problem with consent. This is, before institutional review boards were a thing. So psychedelics were legal. They would sometimes just give them to people in mental hospitals without them really knowing what they were taking. But maybe we could talk about some of the pros and cons of that research as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive into that, and pretty much anything that I would talk about here is also covered at autismonacid.com/research. I've been archiving pretty much everything that I could find along the way, not only like research wise, but also any random articles or blog posts, anything that's been written about the subject. I've just been like bundling there. But moving kind of chronologically, you were referencing some of the work that was led by Dr. Gary Fisher in the 60s, and that was during that legal period of research. And there's a number of ethical issues with that research. It was conducted in refractory populations, in other words, individuals who were adolescents and young children who were institutionalized at that time. The beliefs surrounding the causes of autism were like also very far removed from where they are now. And there's just a lot of, it's a little troubling to look back through that lens. And also at the same point, that's some of the only anecdotal, like rigorously reviewed research we have somewhat. Again, you could also argue also that those standards have still been further updated. But irregardless, there are quotes on the record from researchers of that time who were working with these individuals who are reporting some of the same kinds of changes that our adults who come through our group are discussing with us, as far as like the individuals will like all of a sudden, start maintaining more eye contact with the researchers, or they would like be more engaged in like motility play, or some of them who maybe seem to start to be forming words according to the researchers at that time. Like our current operation, everything that we're doing, we don't go anywhere near to anything discussing any non-adult autistic explorations of any sort. That's like way outside of my bounds of ethics and everything. And really, like, that research happened, and so having those quotes is insightful. Beyond that, I don't feel very comfortable commenting further beyond it. Certainly the work that MAPS did with Alicia Danforth's team and doing the social anxiety studies was much updated and much, much, much more ethical. And they were actually conducting those studies, and each of the individuals actually had support partners present with them, which I think is a really essential component of any sort of future kind of work of this sort. And that's that if we're talking about resolving these issues of social anxiety, I think it's kind of rather integral to have a social situation to be able to, move and navigate through as a learning environment. And so all that research is out there. I think it's like MDMA-autism.org or something. It's all just out there still. It's wonderful work. And, the most recent years, there's only beginning to be some like animal model studies just for like dose ranges related to the potential eventual exploration of using substances like psilocybin in the context of autistic populations. But a lot of the things that you'll find are mapped over more so the concurrent conditions, things like social anxiety, but also as well ideas of like affective empathy increases seen through the lens of psilocybin. And that's another researcher who actually had the pleasure of speaking with on our community group. She came for like a Sunday chat with us, and that was Dr. Katrine Preller out of Switzerland. And she's done a lot of work with social cognition and that with psilocybin and other substances. And so, there is research that's out there. And again, a lot of these conditions, like you'll find, or at least we find in our group, that people who come in, it's very common that they're like, I have ADHD. I don't have an autistic diagnosis. I'm autistic. I don't have an ADHD diagnosis. But anecdotally, their descriptions are so very similar, and there's a lot of concurrent conditions there. And so we can also kind of look at some of that as far as ADHD trials with LSD, like moving into phase 3 very soon, things like that. So it's all, it's all happening. And so we look at our role within the context of the whole is being able to, further grow those understandings and further inform, where to point the focal point of like what to look at or what to explore. Because even if we're talking about just moving through phase 1, 2, 3, it's still just beginning in like the actual practical, like real world application sense. But myself am just a writer of stories. So I also defer to Justine, who's like studying like pharmacology presently. I don't know. She's probably also has some thoughts to share.
Yeah. Justine, tell us what your thoughts are on the science and maybe what you would like to see explored, something that a clinical trial or some sort that you would like to see happen in the future.
Yeah, sure. So as far as the distinction between psychedelics and MDMA, they're wildly different chemicals, and so they behave differently in the body. And I think conceptually, the way that I like to think about it is psychedelics allow you to think about your thinking. It's a concept called like metacognition, and it's kind of like after you take a test and somebody asks you how well you did on your test without knowing the results, the concept of knowing how accurate you will be depending on like thinking about how long you studied, like how you felt about taking the test, and all of these things combined, some people are just better at assessing their own abilities. And I think psychedelics allow people to kind of step outside themselves, like give them a third person perspective, kind of, I guess. And in terms of MDMA, it's more about like feeling the feelings without any sort of like top down, like maybe I shouldn't feel this way, or like what is that, like, and it just like comes. And then the feeling in and of itself might be a novel experience for people, especially when somebody encounters another person in their space, and then like they start to feel things they've never felt before. Like I can't really describe it beyond that, because feeling is kind of like beyond the rational, right? It's like it just kind of happens. I like the analogy I read somewhere that emotion is like energy in motion, because it's so just like fleeting. You're like, what was that? Like that was kind of cool. And to allow people to feel those things, and then that's like the first step to like, how do I feel this again? And so then we start stepping into a territory where, that certain substances have a danger, abuse potential and stuff like that, because it's like, it's allowing you to feel these great feelings. But that's why we recommend, the harm reduction, the safety, because that's where you like, maybe you got to put some limitations there, some boundaries. As far as where I personally would like to see this research go in the future, I think that I don't know, because everybody is approaching this from like all different perspectives. And the only difficult thing is a lot of times us as researchers, just for ethical reasons, we have to use animal models, which becomes very difficult when we're assessing affective disorders like mood disorders, any sort of neurological condition. Like a mouse is not going to tell us like, oh yeah, I remember that. So the translation aspect of it is a little difficult. And so beyond what I would like to see personally, I would like to express people who are consuming these scientific studies to realize that a lot of these things are done in animal models. And so the results are not always going to be directly translatable to human populations. And so I can't emphasize enough to really listen to people when they talk about their benefits, they talk about their experience, because that information is gold as far as like the scientific community goes. And with regard to anything else, just listening can kind of like open your eyes to a whole new world.
Yeah, and that's like, and I think you're referencing one of the recent, like, I think they used like altered rats in order to like make an animal model study for ASD with psilocybin. And so, just to clarify.
So there is a study that came out that used quote unquote an autistic model for mice, and so to explain a little bit of that is researchers have identified a compound that when they introduce it during pregnancy, it's shown to cause autism in human populations. And so they've used that in these mice and rat models, and they have seen some sort of altered behavior in the offspring, and they've made the assumption and they've connected that in the best way that they can. They've kind of correlated it, and to see if that kind of change in behavior is affected after introducing psilocybin to the mice. And it seems to return them to a normal baseline. But again, these are in mice. So it's really hard to is that mice making friends? I don't know.
Yeah. Do you remember what the compound was? The one that causes autism? What was that called?
I think the agent used was valproic acid.
Yeah, so there's been studies linking valproic acid use during pregnancy and the consequences of that later on. And there are other compounds that seem to have a harmful effect in utero, which is something that I'm working to investigate right now, because a lot of these longitudinal studies, the results are coming out. Like there's a group called the Boston cohort where they studied close to 1,000 mother-child pairs, and they tracked them since the 1990s. And so now all the results are coming out of what happened during pregnancy. How did the child develop and what's going on there? And so it's interesting results.
That is really interesting. So if people are interested in this topic, obviously we don't want to encourage them to go buy some drugs on the dark web or something like that. But if they want to know more, or they want to, figure out if there's a way that they could, safely obtain psychedelics, like maybe in a clinical trial or something. Let's say somebody on the spectrum is listening to this episode right now. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, well, one, that's exactly why we exist, not to directly administer any services, but to be able to, first and foremost, before even getting to the point of considering such an exploration, to also come and just spend time with other people within our community as well. I mean, I know it's just an online Zoom meeting and things, but something that we've all learned from coming together as neurodivergent people is that some of the issues that we thought we had were contextual. Like you spend time in a room full of neurodivergent persons and everyone just sort of understands the kinds of accommodations they need to provide for one another. And so in the same way of my own story, going from oh man, I really needed to learn how to human. I was like, oh, I know how to human. It's just I know how to human with certain humans. And then other humans, human different, that's neurodiversity. So we're here primarily, first and foremost, as a support space of just come be yourself with us. It's awesome. It's really fun. We even expanded out now because we started this discussion about psychedelics on Sundays, but now on Wednesday nights we're meeting just for fun, just to have people there and just to connect with them and to give people we do breakout rooms and people kind of have these discussions. But as far as if they're seeking psychedelic services, psychedelic information, whatever it may be, I mean, we exist as a resource for exactly that. We invite people to check out autisticpsychedelic.com, to come to our Zoom meetings. I'm online 3 hours a week with holding basically open office hours to just talk with people. I try to make myself as accessible as I can. And so we're here. And if it's not us, with someone within a broader network that we're able to relay people to and to assist them with it. Because again, and as you said over and over and over again, there's no reason to take any risk for anyone who's curious. There's just no reason to. There's plenty of medically screened, rigorously controlled environments that people can do these explorations in. And these substances, even when they're deemed safe for some people, even when they're deemed legal, even so, they're not safe for all people. And that medical screening component is absolutely essential for anyone considering anything. the worst thing would be like, oh, I'm going to help myself, and to do more damage it's just not good. So it's that, but that's why we exist, to be able to help and guide as best as we can, and to rely on the real professionals beyond us who can really take care of that work in the future.
I just echo the same sentiments about building community, and just talking is sometimes therapeutic in and of itself, just especially during this time when people have been so isolated. It just kind of exacerbates and compounds certain things. So to just like come out into a loving space where people are just, positive vibes everywhere. I sit there and I love it. Like it's like my social time. It's my social hour. So yeah, I do encourage anybody who's interested or maybe having a difficult time with certain things to come and visit us and just have a chat.
Yeah, I attended one of your Zoom meetings in the spring, I think the one with Dr. Preller. And it was great. This is what I'm excited about, is this community of people networking and sharing their experiences, and harm reduction is also really a big part of that as well. I think this is a good place to wrap up. Is there anything else that you want people to know about, or anything that people might have missed in this conversation? Or
no, just really, it's just a warm invitation just to check out the autisticpsychedelic.com site, and click anything there, join anything there, and like legit, like we're just twice a week, we're just out there on the internet. Come talk with us. Like we're here to foster a conversation ongoing. That's our primary aim right now, and we're people out there listening, you guys can help us come to an understanding of what's possible in this exploration. So yeah, just the website, and come talk with us. We're around.
Cool. Yeah. So that's autisticpsychedelic.com. You can also follow on Twitter at psyched. And I guess that's everything. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you
so much, Troy.
Hey, thanks for listening to Narcotica, an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Zachary Siegel, and Troy Farrow. And I'm your co-producer, Garrett Farrow. If you like the show, think we're cool, consider supporting us on Patreon. This show is crowdfunded, and we couldn't do it without you guys. But if Patreon isn't for you, that's fine. You can still help us by spreading the word and giving us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, you name it. Our theme music is by Glass Boy. Additional music is by Vivich, Vyvch, however you pronounce that. And Jenny Shea is the voice of Narcotica. You can follow us on Twitter at NarcoCast, and be sure to have a very nice night.